1 out of 6 casualties in Hitler's war had been psychological, so plenty of work became available for psychiatrists and their claims to a scientific method. And electroshock therapy had not been the only road psychiatrists went down during Hitler's heyday, but doctors operating on monkeys found they were happier about being kept in cages if part of their brain was removed. And that had been happening in Lisbon in 1935, and the following year, doctors at George Washington University had begun trying brain removal on people. By 1946, they were damaging the brain through the eyeball socket with an ice pick and leaving the cut-up brain inside the skull, and they argued about whether or not to make it an office procedure rather than checking the person into a hospital. An office procedure meant the patients could be kept awake because there were no nerve endings inside the skull to feel pain, and the man who thought brain cutting could be done on a walk-in basis went all over the country doing demonstrations, and his name was Freeman, and he used a real ice pick. Freeman drove himself around in a station wagon loaded with camping gear, and he also gave demonstrations of his shock machine, and the victims lost their judgment and their social skills, but it made them quiet, and this pleased their families. Although these dements or lobotomized people had temper problems and couldn't cope with small irritations, so the procedure fell out of favor. Less than 1,000 people had been turned into dements before the end of Hitler's war, and even after the death trains stopped rolling, thousands of these procedures were being done every year. By 1952, 20,000 people were turned into dements, and over half of the mental hospitals were regularly doing it. And when psychiatric drugs came around, lobotomy lost its appeal and was replaced by chemical dementation. The book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, 1932, described soma as the drug of choice in a technological society, and the search for a soma drug began in earnest with the discovery of antihistamines in 1937. Manufactured in France during Hitler's war, histamine had been found by studying ergot, which had been thought to be created by decomposing dead flesh, but histamine was found in the living in 1927, and it was released whenever cells were injured. Histamine affected smooth muscles like the heart and the blood vessels in the brain, and would be released by stress and from cells that were crushed or sunburned or chemically injured by detergents or poison. And histamine also affected the stomach glands as well as the pain and itch nerves. Histamine used calcium to work, so the more histamine, the more it stole calcium from the bones. And the big discovery was that histamine was quelled in the brain by monoamine oxidase, or MAO. Isoniazid, or isonicotinic acid hydrazide, was created in 1951 for the treatment of tuberculosis, and it had mood-elevating effects in tuberculosis patients, and the following year, Dr. DeLay and his collaborators tried isoniazid on his depressed patients, and then Dr. Zeller found that iproniazid inhibited the enzyme MAO. Brain cells released the neurotransmitter serotonin that was related to the psilocybin mushroom, and serotonin could be found in a variety of fruits and nuts, and serotonin was in the sting of the wasp and the prick of the nettle, and a similar substance in the cahobi bean was used by Caribbean aborigines to alter their mood. The same psychoactive compound was secreted by certain toads and was called bufotenin and could be synthesized in the body from dietary tryptophan. Serotonin was isolated at the Cleveland Clinic in 1948 after Dr. Erzspamer and his colleagues were experimenting in Italy during Hitler's best years, and the serotonin made by the body was replaced daily, and it took from 1 to 17 hours to use up the old serotonin excreted with the help of the enzyme MAO. So when MAO was inhibited, the body would keep more serotonin. By 1951, serotonin could be made in a laboratory, and it was quickly discovered that LSD was similar to serotonin and even acted as an antagonist. Serotonin was an autocoid, a word replacing the old word hormone, and the word autocoid came from the Greek autos, or self, and akos, meaning medicine or medicinal treatment, and an autocoid was a neurohumor like serotonin. The brain made most of its serotonin in the pineal gland, where it served as a precursor to the hormone melatonin, and melatonin was involved with sleeping, and MAO inhibitors suppressed REM so people could now sleep without dreams. After the 60s, the medical community would commit itself to giving drugs to mental patients, and by 1955, hundreds of different kinds of tranquilizers had been concocted. And when Librium came along in 1958, 20 dosages of amphetamine were produced for every person in America that year. The first use of methamphetamine had been by Hitler's Blitzkrieg tank corps when they cut through Belgium like a hot knife through butter, and in 1963 Valium would appear, and by 1970 1 woman in 5 and 1 man in 10 was using sedatives and tranquilizers. Histamine removal was not interfered with by MAO inhibitors, and fluoxetine was invented in 1972 as an MAO inhibitor, and the fluoxetine Prozac, among others, was prescribed after 1972 with its popular side effects of weight loss. And according to the History of Psychiatry, Prozac, quote, lightened the burden of self-consciousness, close quote. Prozac had an array of side effects too numerous to list, and fluoxetine withdrawal was dangerous and so unpleasant that most people preferred to stay on the drug, shopping around between all the different brands and juggling the long list of symptoms and side effects. With the manufacture of these medicinal chemicals affecting the brain, the drug industry needed a market, so the DSM came out in 1952 as the official Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it would be revised through the years and used to match symptoms of mental distress with chemical concoctions purported to treat them. The DSM would list over 300 different mental disorders, and since the cause of true illness was either traumatic, infectious, neoplastic, toxic, or autoimmune, a diagnosis of mental illness was difficult to explain as a science, while another field of study showed that malnourishment during prenatal development caused starved babies to go crazy when they grew up. Homosexuals were declared to be free of disease by the psychiatric community in 1974, and homosexuality was removed from the list of mental illnesses just as government laboratories began experimenting with AIDS, since, after all, if homosexuals were merely mentally ill, it wouldn't do to murder them. Given such actions, it would be difficult to take seriously any official psychiatric pronouncement about problems surrounding sexual orientation, the psychiatry of stress, or women and the menses. These matters could all be apparently pathologized and depathologized at the will of the majority or following campaigns of insistent pressure groups. The underlying failure to let science point the way emphasized the extent to which DSM-3 and its successors, designed to lead psychiatry away from the swamp of psychoanalysis, was in fact guiding it into the wilderness. History of Psychiatry, page 305. After the Great War, people began talking about the new theories of Darwinism. People talking about the new theories of Darwinism had decided that addiction was a scientific disease rather than a moral failing, and Darwin had been regarded as a scientist of the highest caliber, and in the 30s, science was all the rage. The debate began in earnest whether drug addiction was a biological illness or was willful disobedience. And to use the DSM, the first question that needed to be asked was whether an organic factor was involved in the mental illness, such as brain damage from injury or viral infection in childhood, or whether the quote-unquote mental illness had been caused by the use of mind-altering substances such as alcohol or recreational drugs. And the second question was whether those chemicals had been taken voluntarily. The DSM described addiction as problematic if it caused, quote, interference with social or occupational functioning, close quote, which meant that if addiction were present and the person were asking for help, they would not be mentally ill. Nonetheless, drug addicts became cannon fodder for psychologists and psychiatrists, and psychiatry became more of a business than a science in the wake of socialized medicine, because the taxpayer was paying the bill and the government had deep pockets. A dictionary definition of the phrase socialized medicine was, quote, healthcare at nominal cost by means of government regulation of health services and subsidies derived from taxation, close quote. And the word socialism was defined as an economy where, quote, producers possess both political power and the means of producing and distributing goods, close quote. And under socialized medicine, the government was allowed not only to decide who was not only who was and who was not an addict, but what treatment was mandated. A scientific pursuit of psychiatry was impossible due to the doctor requiring the patient to supply subjective symptoms rather than objective proofs, and psychiatrists were in competition with fortune tellers, priests, and bartenders, and so psychiatry required government intervention in order to stay in business. Well-meaning psychiatrists tended to convince the public that doctors worked better than handcuffs, and the realm of drug addiction became an issue of class warfare, since the poor were less able to hide their addictions, and the judicial system figured that they were better off with 3 hots and a cot if they were unable to support themselves on the outside. Legal representation became a matter of making due process and exercise in accommodating the system, and inmates involved in the drug and alcohol trade behind bars found many underpaid prison guards willing to enable and accommodate them in the business. Addiction is also a family matter, as important as it is to help the patient. Educating, supporting, and counseling relatives may be the therapist's most valuable and enduring contribution. It's also a quote-unquote family matter in another sense. Healthcare professionals are at high risk for addiction, and they and their relatives are also, quote, our family, close quote. Essential Psychopathology by Gerald S. Maxman, M.D., New York, W.W. Norton and Company, 1986, page 140. Thomas Szasz wrote The Myth of Mental Illness in 1961 that fully infuriated the ballooning quote-unquote mental health industry, and Szasz also wrote Ceremonial Chemistry in 1971. And Szasz had moved to America from Hungary in 1938 and gotten a degree in physics before becoming a doctor in 1944. Thomas Szasz had been born in Hungary in 1920, and his parents were Jewish, and Szasz would repeat the warning from the Brookings Institute that we should, 1, not assume that a thing is the cause of another simply because it comes before another, like day following night, but day does not cause night. 2, not suppose that a single thing makes another happen because the result is usually the result of a number of things. 3, not believe that the whole world is just like some of the parts we know. 4, not expect things to happen in the future just as they've happened in the past. 5, not wish for only what we want. And 6, not see and believe only those things we want to see and believe. What remained was the miracle of the salvation of a cold beer on a hot day, the blessing of champagne at a wedding, the mercy of brandy at a funeral. And in the face of such immutable facts, the mental health business could not suppress addiction altogether, but instead worked diligently to suppress the symptoms and the consequences of drinking. The mental health industry used mind-altering drugs when a whole mind was needed to overcome addiction, and they turned the scientific model on its head with their theory that addiction was caused by quote-unquote mental illness, rather than caused by the excessive use of mood-altering chemicals for which people were paying good hard cash money. The mental health industry ignored the fact that, quote, getting crazy, unquote, was why people so ardently used mood-altering chemicals in the first place, and the industry doubled down with their insistence that crazy people needed to use booze and drugs to help them cope with being mentally ill. "Mr. Prime Minister, would you like something to drink?" Churchill said. "Oh, yes, bring me a martini." He downed 3 or 4 at a good clip. From there we progressed to the President's room at the Statler and got Churchill, who was in very good spirits by now, to the head table. "Mr. Prime Minister, would you care to have a little something with your lunch?" Churchill brightened and said, "Yes, I believe a Scotch and soda." He sipped Scotch right through the meal. By the time the press conference started, Churchill showed his drinks, but his pipe organ voice and sharp mind were not impaired. He started talking at 1:30, and the conference lasted till 4:30. Nobody who was there ever wished it was 1 minute less. It was the most scintillating press conference I ever attended. He became poetic, and his command of the language carried us to new heights of emotion. I remember an old congressman from Minnesota who said about Churchill that the more he drank, the more brilliant he got. I don't believe Churchill was ever quite that brilliant again. Drunk Before Noon, the behind-the-scenes story of the Washington Press Corps by Ken Hoyt and Francis Spatz Layton, New Jersey, Prentice Hall, 1979, page 64 and 5. In the good old days, alcohol was everyone's best medicine. In the good old days, alcohol was everyone's best medicine, and opium was used to treat DTs from alcohol withdrawal, and opium was most effective when mixed with alcohol, and cure-all potions contain mostly alcohol, but the opium in them took the alcohol debate into a whole new dimension. Opium had been given freely as a painkiller because pain was the disease, and opium was also effective against dysentery and cholera when water purification had been neither known nor practiced, and poor people were less likely to get addicted because rich people were more likely to hire doctors, and doctors were in the habit of growing their own opium or staying in close touch with people who were. Medical schools in Europe had been serious institutions, but American doctors were mostly trained as apprentices to doctors who already had a practice, and the apprentice would learn their trade by field experience, and because these doctors left much to be desired, Americans had learned to self-medicate, and the patent medicine industry in America had become big business. Fantastic formulas, which at best were ineffectual and at worst destroyed health, brought the patent medicine practitioners millions of dollars. Quacks and swindlers, they became outstanding members of their communities. They donated money to churches and political campaigns. They took a firm grip on the newspapers, and since they were respectable, typical examples of American enterprise and success, it became nothing less than socialism to challenge them. The Muckrakers, Crusaders for American Liberalism by Louis Filler, Chicago, a Gateway edition, Henry Regnery Company, 1950-1968, page 145. Patent medicines came from the sinful cities, and so had the limp-wristed, pencil-necked, bug-eyed, late-sleeping city people who couldn't even swing a pitchfork, according to Martin Booth in his Opium, A History. And before 1850, Most people lived and died within 50 miles of their own homes, and every so often a traveling salesman would come through, touting medical cures that were most effective if opium were included in the formula, that secret ingredient known well before the writing of any history.